The trouble began with a whisper. It was a nasty snaking sound that slithered through the dragon caves of Mount Firebreath. The great dragons with scales like jewels and hearts full of fire felt it first as a chill. Their mighty flames, which could melt stone and turn sand to glass, began to flicker and fade. Young dragons, once full of playful fire puffs, could barely manage a smoky cough. The oldest dragon, Ignis, with scales the color of a dying sunset and eyes as deep as the world, knew this was no ordinary sickness. It was a curse, ancient and hungry, draining the very magic from their fiery souls. The mountain grew colder with every passing hour, a deep and unnatural frost creeping over the warm stones of their homes. Far below the mountain, in the twisting, shadowy tunnels of the ghoul lands, a similar dread was unfolding. Ghouls, who loved the damp dark and the taste of mossy stones, found their world growing too dark. The familiar comforting gloom was replaced by a thick, smothering blackness that swallowed all sound and light. The glowing fungi that lit their paths began to dim and die, their gentle light sputtering out like sad little stars. Even their ghoulish ability to see in the dark was failing them. Griselda, the ghoul queen, with her wise pale eyes and a crown of glowing crystals, felt the curse as a suffocating silence. It was a magic that stole shadows, leaving nothing but an empty, terrifying void. Ignis the dragon and Griselda the ghoul did not know each other. In fact, dragons and ghouls had been enemies for as long as anyone could remember. Dragons thought ghouls were creepy, crawly things that lived in the dirt. Ghouls thought dragons were loud, smoky bullies who burned everything. But both leaders knew they could not fight this creeping doom alone. Ignis looked down from his freezing mountain peak. Griselda looked up from her fading tunnels. They both felt the same pull, a strange tug from an ancient magic, leading them to the one place where the curse felt strongest, the murky Middle Mire, a spooky swamp that lay exactly between the mountain and the tunnels. The curse was a creature of its own, a being made of pure spite called the Shadow Blight. It fed on the magic of powerful creatures, growing stronger by stealing their light and their darkness. It had slept for 1,000 years, but now it was awake and very, very hungry. It wanted to consume all the dragon fire and all the ghoul shadow, leaving the world a grey, lifeless husk. The Shadow Blight didn't care about old rivalries or ancient squabbles. It saw the dragons and the ghouls as two delicious halves of a single meal, and as it grew stronger, both Ignis and Griselda realized with a lurch of terror that they would have to face it, or face extinction. Ignis decided he must act. He flew down from Mount Firebreath, his great wings catching the cold wind. He landed with a heavy thump at the edge of the murky Middle Mire. The air was thick with the smell of rot and fear. He waited, his golden eyes scanning the gloomy trees and bubbling mud pits. He didn't have to wait long. From the darkest part of the swamp, a figure emerged. It was Griselda, followed by her bravest ghoul champions. They moved without a sound, their pale forms seeming to glide over the muck. The dragons who had come with Ignis let out low, rumbling growls. The ghouls hissed back, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The meeting was not off to a good start. "Dragon!" Griselda said, her voice a soft, echoing whisper. "Your fire is dying." Her words were not meant to be an insult, but a statement of fact. However, a young hot-headed dragon named Scorch took it the wrong way. He puffed out his chest and tried to breathe a jet of flame, but only a sad little cloud of grey smoke came out. He looked terribly embarrassed. The ghouls tittered, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. Scorch's scales flushed red with anger, and he bared his sharp teeth. The tension in the mire grew so thick you could almost scoop it with a bucket. It was clear that centuries of mistrust would not disappear easily. "And your shadows are fading, ghoul," Ignis rumbled, his voice deep and ancient like shifting rock. He was too old and too worried to be insulted. He could see the fear in Griselda's eyes, and he knew it matched his own. "A curse is upon us. It eats my fire and your darkness. Alone, we will be consumed. Together. Well, together we might have a chance." He tried to sound hopeful, but even to his own ears, the words sounded thin and desperate. The idea of working with these silent, spooky creatures felt wrong, like trying to fly underwater. But the cold seeping into his old bones told him it was the only way. Griselda tilted her head, considering the giant, scaly creature before her. Dragons were all about brightness and noise and heat. Ghouls were about silence and coolness and the gentle dark. How could they possibly work together? One of her ghoul champions, a lanky fellow named Skulk, shuddered. "They smell of smoke and sunshine," he whispered with disgust. "It's unnatural!" Griselda silenced him with a look. She knew Skulk was right. It was unnatural, but the curse was more unnatural still. With a slow nod, she agreed. "We will try, Dragon. We will try to trust you. For now." The alliance was formed, but it was as wobbly as a baby deer on ice. The new allies decided to travel together to the heart of the curse, a ruined castle in the center of the swamp. The journey was filled with difficulties. The dragons, used to soaring high in the sky, had to walk carefully on the ground to stay with the ghouls. A young dragon named Cinder accidentally set a patch of dry reeds on fire with a nervous sneeze spark. The ghouls, who hated bright light and sudden noises, all shrieked and dove into the mud for cover. It took Griselda 10 minutes to coax them back out, their pale faces smudged with muck and their feelings quite hurt. Cinder felt awful and tried to apologize, but his rumbling voice just made them flinch again. Later, the ghouls tried to be helpful. They knew the safest paths through the swamp. Skulk led the way, pointing out the sinking mud and the patches of grabber grass. But his way of helping was to whisper warnings from the shadows, suddenly appearing by a dragon's ear to say, "Don't step there!" A big tough dragon named Fuma almost jumped out of his scales in fright and accidentally whacked Skulk with his tail. Skulk wasn't hurt, but he was very offended. He complained to Griselda that the dragons were clumsy and jumpy. It was becoming very clear that what was normal for one group was absolutely terrifying for the other. The strangest moment came when they stopped to rest. The dragons huddled together, trying to share what little warmth they had left. The ghouls meanwhile started munching on their travel snacks, giant hairy cave spiders. A young ghoul named Morb offered one politely to Cinder. Cinder looked at the spider's 8 wiggling legs and 8 glassy eyes and turned a shade of pale green. He politely declined, explaining that dragons preferred their food, well, cooked. Morb was confused. "But cooking would burn off all the best juicy bits," he exclaimed. They stared at each other, one holding a wiggling spider, the other trying not to be sick. It was a moment of pure, baffling misunderstanding. Despite the spiders and the sneezes, something was changing. Cinder noticed that Morb was actually quite funny, in a quiet, gloomy sort of way. Griselda saw that Ignis, for all his size and smoke, was wise and deeply worried for his people. The dragons started to appreciate how the ghouls could find paths in the dark. The ghouls began to understand that the dragon's fire wasn't meant to be scary. It was their warmth, their life. They were still very different. They were still a bit scared of each other. But as they got closer to the ruined castle, they were starting to look less like 2 separate groups and more like one very, very strange team. They finally reached the ruined castle. A sickly purple light pulsed from its highest tower, where the shadow blight waited. The air was freezing, and the darkness was so complete that even the ghouls felt blind. The blight revealed itself, a swirling vortex of shadowy tentacles and hateful purple energy. It lashed out, and the dragons and ghouls scattered. Scorch tried to blast it with fire, but his flame was weak, and the shadow simply swallowed it. The ghouls tried to use their shadow magic to confuse it, but the blight was made of shadow, and it only grew stronger. They were losing. The curse was too powerful. Despair began to creep into their hearts. "It feeds on our magic alone," Ignis roared, his voice cracking with effort. "But what if we mix them?" Griselda understood instantly. It was a crazy idea, a desperate gamble. Fire and shadow, light and dark, they were opposites. Combining them could tear them all apart, but doing nothing meant they would be consumed anyway. "Do it!" she called out. "Ghouls, lend your shadows to the dragon's fire!" The ghouls looked at her, then at the dragons, their eyes wide with fear. But they trusted their queen. They began to chant, weaving their dark energy not as an attack, but as a gift. The ghouls channeled their cool, silent magic towards the dragons. The dragons, in turn, breathed in the strange, dark power. It felt wrong, like inhaling ice, but they held it. Cinder felt the ghoul magic swirl inside him, mixing with the last embers of his dragon fire. Then, following Ignis's command, all the dragons breathed out at once. It wasn't fire that emerged, and it wasn't shadow. It was something new. A blast of shimmering twilight energy, silver and gold, warm and cool, silent and roaring all at once. It was beautiful and strange and powerful. The twilight flame slammed into the shadow blight, and for the first time, the creature shrieked in pain. The battle raged. The ghouls would gather the darkness, focusing it into shimmering orbs of shadow. The dragons would then inhale these orbs and unleash blasts of twilight fire. It was perfect teamwork. The dragons provided the raw power, and the ghouls provided the magical fuel that the blight couldn't consume. Together, they pushed the shadow blight back, its shadowy form sizzling and dissolving under the combined assault. With one final mighty push, Ignis and Griselda led a combined blast that struck the creature's core. The shadow blight exploded in a flash of purple light. And then, silence. The curse was broken. As warmth returned to the air and soft light returned to the shadows, dragons and ghouls looked at each other, not as enemies, but as heroes, friends.